Now to the first of our three speakers. Nerissa's topic today, Save Australian Women's Sports. Nerissa is a former radio broadcaster and journalist. She's concerned about the erosions of women's sex-based rights and the silencing of women who dare to speak out about this. She is a proud woman, adult, human, female, and is honoured to stand with the many other brave women who will not shut up. Nerissa speaks today as a representative of Save Women's Sports Australasia, and you can follow them on Facebook. Thanks, Nerissa.
Thank you very much, Anna. So, as Anna said, I'll be talking about women's sport. Firstly, I recall an early memory of sexism when girls were made to wear a dress as part of the school uniform. So this was a small public school and I was about 11. I protested to the principal, arguing that as girls we also wanted to play and run and jump and roll around at recess and lunchtime, just like the boys, and wearing dresses restricted this. Despite thinking I made a good cause, the male principal wasn't prepared to change the uniform, and it remained that we were only allowed to wear shorts, the girls, on sports day, Thursdays, I think, from memory. If I were a little girl today and I took this stand, I wonder would my gender identity be questioned? I was a tomboy, after all. Apparently that's not PC now. Short hair sometimes, wrote poetry about wanting to be a boy, played in the mud, rode BMX. I checked and it was only in 2011 that the girls' uniform was updated to allow the girls to wear shorts, 18 years later. So anywho, I've been asked to talk about women's sport in Australia, specifically the issue of biological males being allowed to compete in the women's category if they identify as women, whatever that means. The issue was catapulted into the public consciousness at the start of this month when 8 peak Australian sporting bodies announced new gender diversity and inclusivity policies allowing biological males to compete in women's sport. 13 more sporting codes are said to be planning to follow suit. So women's sport was created to provide females an opportunity to a level playing field and a fair competition against other girls and women, as well as an environment where they can achieve and excel in sport in the same way that males do in the male category. We also have separate categories for disabled people and children. In sport, providing a fair, safe and meaningful competition is paramount. So I'll assume that even without looking at this graph, like me, you know that the notion of allowing males to participate in female sport is so obviously grossly unfair for girls and women. In Australia, we have federal legislation, the Sex Discrimination Act 1984, which states, pursuant to Section 42 of the Act, people of one gender, that is sex, aged 12 and over, can be excluded from participating in competitive sporting activities in which the strength, stamina and physique of competitors is relevant. So looking at Section 42 of the Sex Discrimination Act, it states nothing in Division 1 or 2 renders it unlawful to discriminate on the ground of sex, gender identity or intersex status by excluding persons from participation in any competitive sporting activity in which the strength, stamina or physique of competitors is relevant. So biological males can be excluded from women's competition. And this applies to all sports because in all sports, strength, stamina and physique is relevant. And all sport is competitive. By allowing males to compete in the women's category, women's sport are going to end up excluding girls and women, many of whom will decide or be forced to opt out. One reason is due to safety. Many will not want to compete against male-bodied persons due to safety concerns. You don't need to be Einstein to see why. Research shows there's a minimum 20 to 30% increase in injury risk factors, even with testosterone suppression in line with the current International Olympic Committee rules. Privacy is another issue. Many females don't want to and should not be forced into a situation where they must share changing facilities and showers with biological males, where they're unable to avoid the male gaze. And religion. Some religions and cultures don't permit a girl to undress in the presence of males, be present in a space where a male may also be in a state of undress, or permit bodily contact with males. Again, the reason to have a dedicated female sports category seems obvious. But for those who still think it's better to be kind, we know, for instance, elite high school male athletes frequently outperform female Olympians. If you go to boysversuswomen.com, you can check out lots of different categories. Spoiler alert, all of the graphs end up looking similar to these two, with the blue at the top representing the superior male athletes. Personally, I dream of a time when all sporting codes follow the lead of USA powerlifting, who don't allow males in the female category, and females are also not allowed in the male category, due to testosterone use being prohibited in the sport, as it should be. From their website, they state men naturally have a larger bone structure, higher bone density, stronger connective tissue, and higher muscle density than women. These traits, even with reduced levels of testosterone, do not go away. They assert that use of testosterone and participation of male to female transgender athletes in our sport compromises fair play. Save Women's Sports in the US was founded by the amateur powerlifter and mum, Beth Stelzer, who competes in the USA powerlifting competitions. And after gender activists demanded a biological male be allowed to compete against women and staged a protest at one of Beth's competitions, Beth couldn't stay silent any longer. Now, here at Save Women's Sport Australasia, we're working with our sisters in New Zealand, the US and Canada to defend women's sport, raise awareness and to lobby to repeal unfair and unsafe policies. Save Women's Sport is a coalition that seeks to preserve biology-based eligibility standards for participation in female sports. That is, we believe sports should continue to be categorised based on sex, not gender identity. Coach Linda Blade, the president of Alberta Athletics Canada, asserts sport is categorised on biology, not ideology. Fairness has to be there for meaning. Coach Blade highlights the importance of sport for the lives of girls and women. For instance, many of the C-suite CEOs of mega corporations, a lot of those women who've risen to the top of those organisations had sport in their background. The inclusion of males in women's sport also goes against the findings of the recent consultation by World Rugby. Dr. Nicola Williams, a research scientist in human biology from Fair Play for Women, and Dr. Emma Hilton, the developmental biologist from the University of Manchester, were among the experts invited to participate in the landmark risk assessment workshop in February. It found there's a minimum of 20 to 30% increase in injury risk factors when typical male-bodied and female-bodied players are involved in tackles, even when trans-identified males suppress their testosterone in line with current IOC rules. And the research shows men on average sprint 15% faster, throw 30% further, have 40% higher endurance, and punch 160% heavier. The consultation notes from this meeting were released in July this year. Clearly, this evidence and these risks were not considered important, and this month Australia's peak sporting agency, Sport Australia, along with Pride in Sport, a lobby group, with next to zero consultation with women's groups, parents groups and actual girls and women, completely ignored the findings and introduced their new policies. You might recall Sport Australia acting CEO Richard Dalton. He's the one who was unable to define what a woman is when asked by Claire Chandler, the Tasmanian Liberal Senator in Federal Parliament at the Senate committee hearing earlier this year. The groundwork for these policies was laid last year when Sport Australia partnered with the Australian Human Rights Commission to develop the guidelines for the inclusion of transgender and gender diverse people in sport. Fair Go for Queensland Women discovered through a Freedom of Information request, out of 100 organisations involved over a 12-month process, only one women's organisation was consulted. The government agency won't say who was consulted. However, we have learned that Pride in Sport received $10 million in taxpayer funding from New South Wales Health alone, and another $10 million in corporate funding. Oh, and there was no risk assessment carried out. 0. That's part of the freedom of information. The guidelines also contravene the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. It rolls off the tongue. So it's an international treaty to which Australia is a signatory, and it makes up part of the Sex Discrimination Act. So Article 3 states parties shall take in all fields, in particular in the political, social, economic and cultural fields, all appropriate measures, including legislation, to ensure the full development and advancement of women. And Article 10 states that the parties shall ensure women have the same opportunities to participate actively in sports and physical education. So after these Sport Australia policies were introduced, World Rugby confirmed they would be adopting the transgender guidelines, which support in part the call from many women around the world to keep biological males out of women's sport, due to both the massive biological advantage as well as the increased risk to the health and safety of female players. The statement from World Rugby on their website concluded that safety and fairness cannot presently be assured for women competing against trans women in contact rugby. Unfortunately, this only applies to the elite and international level, as World Rugby doesn't have jurisdiction over the community levels. Many, including Senator Chandler, have called this out, saying the decision further highlights the absurdity of the Australian sporting bodies in adopting the position that inclusiveness is more important than women's safety. If it is not safe or fair for a professional female rugby player to have to play against biological males, then it isn't safe or fair for Australian women playing at their local club either. So let's take a look at the new guidelines of One Australian Sport now with a case study. So I was particularly struck by the hypocrisy in the AFL guidelines. So we'll look at the AFL's pre-existing female football match guide first. That's available on the AFL website. So they talk about the key considerations for female footballers, and they mention that within a mixed gender, which is a mixed sex team, the skill acquisition of a non-athletic boy is greater than for a non-athletic girl. That's from Dr. Fleur McIntyre at the University of Notre Dame. The guide goes on to state the benefits of females staying involved in sporting activities. So they mention things like learning about teamwork, winning and losing, sport providing a positive impact on personal, physical and social development, that the skills learnt in sport transfer to non-athletic areas of life, and of course mental wellbeing. I've summarised the introduction on the left there for you. So it basically states that it is well documented that girls want to play in female-only competitions. They give a few other reasons. Females are more likely to improve their skills in single-gender settings, which is single-sex settings. And according to the document, the safety of female participants is paramount and has been considered in the laws of the game. And importantly, it states once a girl turns 14 years, she is no longer eligible to participate in a mixed gender team. However, through the AFL's research, it is not the preference of females to be members of mixed gender teams anyway. Throughout the document, they conflate sex with gender. Sex refers to biology, gender refers to sex role stereotypes. The policy goes on to quote the Federal Sex Discrimination Act, which we've already looked at. So as we established earlier, under the Act, biological males can be excluded from the women's competition. And this applies to all sports because in all sports, strength, stamina and physique are relevant, even more so in physical contact sports like Aussie rules. In the AFL's female football match guide, it also identifies injuries as one of the reasons for lack of female participation, while one of the environmental factors noted is female facilities are not female friendly. And the guide also mentions, again, placing player welfare foremost. Sadly now it appears female player welfare has been thrown out the window. Under the new policy, biological males are allowed to compete in the female category. At the elite level, they'll be required to prove their testosterone levels have been at or below 5 nanomoles per litre for at least 2 years prior to the AFLW bid. Remembering that females' average testosterone level is between 0 and 1.3 nanomoles per litre. yet the AFL prohibits females over the age of 14 from competing in the men's league due to player welfare. Surely by allowing males to play in the women's league and use the female facilities, the AFL is jeopardising female player welfare and increasing injury risks, which will result in a reduction of female participation. It is also certainly making the female facilities not female friendly, as males could be present there. To clarify, males are not prevented from playing in the women's category because of their gender identity. They are rightly and lawfully prevented from playing in the women's category because of their sex, because they are biologically male. And by the AFL's own guideline, apparently it's well documented that girls want to play in female-only competitions. Anyway, so the league's new gender diversity policy means males who want to compete in the women's competition at a community level don't have to reduce their testosterone. They just simply self-declare that they are women. So gender diverse players may not be excluded for reasons of relevant competitive advantage over cisgender players in the competition. So the new AFL policy contradicts federal anti-discrimination legislation, which they had previously quoted in their own female football match guide. And as an aside, many women, including myself, reject cis. We are not a subset of our own sex. The inclusion of this language in this document is evidence of institutional and policy capture. The implication too is that community sport is not competitive, which we know is false. Community sport feeds into elite sport. Sports skills and ability are developed through playing at the amateur level, and those who are gifted in a particular sport advance to a professional or elite level. If males are competing in the women's category at the community level, this will discourage female participation, and women will be excluded in the name of inclusion. So here in Queensland, the Queensland Human Rights Commission has a set of guidelines for schools which state, you may have heard it said that trans and gender diverse students have a physical advantage over other students in sport, particularly male to female trans athletes. While this may be occasionally true, under Queensland laws, students cannot be excluded from recreational sport on the basis of their gender identity. While this may be occasionally true. For one, this statement is patently untrue. Secondly, it is phrased in such a way as to imply that this occasional circumstance has no real bearing on the biologically female competitors, and it contravenes anti-discrimination legislation. Comparing the 2016 School Sport Australia Spring Championship under 12 for 100 metre sprint in this slide, boys' results are at the top, girls' results are at the bottom. The boys are faster. And then we've got the 100 metre results from the 2019 Queensland School Sport under 14 boys and girls. Girls' results are at the top, boys at the bottom. The boys are faster. These results show that it is not occasionally true that the boys are faster than the girls. It shows that boys are faster than girls. They have a physical biological advantage due to them being male. Since males have the SRY gene that's responsible for triggering male sex determination, aside from a small number of individuals with differences in sex development. Same applies when you look at physical strength due to more than just testosterone. Meanwhile, the Queensland Human Rights Commission guidelines say that under Queensland laws, students cannot be excluded from recreational school sport on the basis of their gender identity. Again, that's in direct contradiction of the Queensland Anti-Discrimination Act, 91. A person may restrict participation in a competitive sporting activity to either males or females if it's reasonable having regard to the strength, stamina or physique requirements of the activity. And subsection 1 does not stop participation in a competitive sporting activity being restricted on the basis of gender identity, if the restriction is reasonable having regard to the strength, stamina or physique requirements of the activity. So according to legislation, people can be excluded on the basis of gender identity or sex if strength, stamina or physique are relevant, which is all sport, not just competitive sport, because recreational and community sport feed into elite sport, and it's patronising to suggest that females who compete at this level are not competitive. The Queensland Human Rights Commission website also contains some contradictions, surprise, and lists exemptions under the Sex Discrimination Act. Some of them are mentioned there. Oh, so participation in competitive sporting activity may be restricted to males or females, yes. And another example they give for welfare measures, a local council may provide funding for a men's shed to be run by men and for men only. Instead of pandering to woke activists, Australian sporting bodies should instead be setting clear rules that ensure female sport remains safe, fair and accessible to females. We make up 50% of the population and are still considerably underrepresented in many sports. Senator Claire Chandler, who has been advocating to protect women's sports for biological females, says removing female-only sport as a standalone category is not inclusive, it is insulting and unfair. Dr. Nicola Williams from Fair Play for Women points out we don't base a protected sport category on an athlete's internal sense of identity, we base it on body types. While everyone has the right to play sport, no one has the right to play in any category they choose. So maybe it's the male sex category we need to open up for all gender identities, not the protected female category. Trans-identifying male Miranda Yardley demonstrated this just last month when lacing up their new rugby boots to play on the men's side. There's Miranda's new boots. Afterwards, Miranda said, "I am delighted to confirm men's rugby is more than happy to accommodate all males, trans-identifying or otherwise, and this is no obstacle to them playing rugby." At Save Women's Sport, we sincerely hope that the men's sport category will welcome and include all males in all their diversity and allow the female category to remain as it is. Retaining female categories means safety, fairness, participation and retention are maintained for women and girls. If you feel passionate about this issue, write to the Queensland Sports Minister, Mike De Brenny, or the Sports Minister in your state to raise your concerns. You can follow Save Women's Sport Australasia on socials. You can get involved in a feminist group if there's one in your city. If there isn't one, consider setting one up. And finally, I tip my hat to all the brave women who are speaking out here today, as well as all around the world. Big ups to Roe Edge, Kath Deeves, Linda Blade, and the many more amazing women at Save Women's Sport. Senator Claire Chandler too. I first learned what was happening with gender identity, ideology and extremism online. Yes, on that cesspit that is Twitter. And at the time, comedian Graham Linehan and many vocal and passionate women were speaking out. The late, great Magdalene Burns, for one. They were all being labelled transphobic, and many have since been banned, cancelled, no platformed. They've lost their jobs, been threatened, harassed, doxed, and even physically assaulted and attacked. Linehan wrote a short note recently in response to a photoshopped image of him being hanged alongside J.K. Rowling and others who assert the reality of biological sex. It was directed to those who say, "I can't speak up because if I do, I'll lose my job." Firstly, you have a lot of company. Secondly, those who are first through the door, those who do take a bullet for the cause, those who first speak up, those who do imperil their careers, need to not be left hanging. After the first one through the door, there needs to be another and another. After the first person who speaks, there needs to be another and then another. Don't leave the courageous ones hanging. Join them. Take the risks they are taking.